Have you ever felt like giving up on English? Or even on your dream of starting a new life? In this video, I'll share a simple real story from my life in America. How my broken English, a small business idea, and the kindness of complete strangers slowly changed everything. If you've ever doubted yourself, stay with me. Because the most surprising part of this journey comes later. The day I almost gave up. A strange thing often happens when people try to learn English or start a new life in another country. The moment when everything feels too difficult is often the exact moment when something important is about to begin. One cold evening in America, I was standing outside a small neighborhood grocery store with a cheap cup of coffee in my hand, thinking very seriously about quitting my dream. At that time, my English was slow. Very slow. Reading was not too bad. I could understand simple sentences. Listening was harder, but sometimes I caught the main idea. Speaking, however, felt like trying to walk through deep snow while carrying a heavy bag. Every word required effort. Every sentence required courage. Many learners imagine that speaking English should feel natural after studying for some time. But the reality is different. The brain needs repetition, real conversations, and emotional experiences to truly build language ability. Without those things, English stays inside textbooks instead of becoming a real skill. That evening in America, the air was cold and the wind pushed through the empty parking lot. Street lights reflected on wet pavement after a short rain. Cars passed by quickly, and people walked into the grocery store talking confidently in English. Meanwhile, my brain was busy repeating a very simple sentence. Hello. How are you today? It sounds easy. It really does. But when someone moves to a new country, the brain is constantly translating. It hears English, turns it into your first language, understands it slowly, then tries to build an answer in English again. This process takes time. Sometimes too much time for a normal conversation. That was exactly my situation. The strange thing about language learning is that silence becomes comfortable very quickly. When speaking feels difficult, the brain prefers to avoid it. No speaking means no embarrassment, no mistakes, no awkward moments. But avoiding English also stops improvement. Psychologists explain that the human brain always searches for efficiency. If something feels uncomfortable, the brain quietly suggests a simple solution. Stop doing it. That little voice is not loud. It whispers, maybe this is not for you. Standing outside that grocery store, holding a cup of coffee that was already getting cold, that voice became stronger in my mind. Maybe English is just too difficult. Maybe starting a business in America is unrealistic. Maybe people like me should choose an easier path. Those thoughts appear in many minds, especially for immigrants, students, or anyone trying to build a new life in another country. The outside world often looks confident and fast, while inside the brain everything moves slowly. But something interesting about America is this. Small moments between strangers can completely change a day. While I was standing there thinking about my future, a man walked out of the grocery store carrying 2 paper bags filled with food. He looked like someone who had just finished work. Tired, but relaxed. He walked past me, then stopped for a moment and looked up at the sky. Then he said something simple. Cold night tonight. Just 3 words. My brain recognized the meaning immediately. But answering was another story. My mind suddenly became busy, like too many programs running on a computer. Cold night tonight. Should I respond? What if my grammar is wrong? What if he doesn't understand me? Those 2 seconds felt long. Finally, I answered with the simplest sentence I could build. Yes, very cold tonight. It was not perfect English. The rhythm was strange. The grammar was simple. But the sentence was real. And something small, but important, happened. The man smiled. Not a polite smile that people use when they want to leave. A friendly smile. Yeah, he said. Winter is coming. Then he laughed a little and asked another simple question. You live around here? The conversation lasted maybe 20 seconds. Nothing complicated. Just small talk about the weather and the neighborhood. The kind of conversation Americans have every day without thinking about it. But for me, it felt like a breakthrough. Language researchers often explain that the brain learns faster when emotion is involved. Moments with surprise, relief, or connection create stronger memories. That short conversation stayed in my mind much longer than hours of studying grammar. Because it proved something important. Perfect English was not required for communication. Simple English was enough. Real conversation was enough. And sometimes, strangers are surprisingly patient. Walking home that night, something inside my thinking quietly changed. Instead of asking, how can I speak perfect English? A different question appeared in my mind. How can I speak simple English every day? That small change in thinking is powerful. When people chase perfection, they often freeze. When people focus on daily practice, progress begins naturally. Simple conversations become easier. Confidence grows. And opportunities slowly appear. At that time, I didn't realize how important that idea would become. Months later, those simple conversations with neighbors, co-workers and customers would slowly lead to something unexpected. A business idea. A community. And something even more surprising. People I had never met before, complete strangers, would start believing in me. Not because my English was perfect, but because effort is something people in America understand very well. That cold evening outside the grocery store felt like a moment of doubt. In reality, it was the beginning of a very different chapter. The story that followed involved learning English through daily life, understanding American culture, building relationships, and slowly turning a small idea into a real business. And the most surprising part? The people who helped the most were not friends or family at the beginning. They were strangers. The next part explains why learning English feels slow for many people, and the simple change that helped me improve much faster once I understood it. Why learning English felt so hard. Something confusing happens to many people who arrive in the United States. English seems familiar at first. After all, you may have studied it for years. You recognize words. You understand basic grammar. You even remember long vocabulary lists from school. But then real life begins. A cashier asks a simple question, and suddenly the brain becomes slow. Someone speaks quickly, and the sentence disappears before the mind can catch it. A friendly neighbor says hello, and the answer gets stuck somewhere between thought and mouth. That was exactly my experience during the first months in America. On paper, my English looked acceptable. I knew grammar rules. I had studied vocabulary. I could read articles slowly. But real conversations felt completely different. The reason is actually very simple, and language scientists talk about it often. There is a big difference between knowing English and using English in real time. Knowing English lives in memory. Using English lives in the brain's reaction speed. In normal conversation, people do not wait for grammar calculations. They speak quickly, respond emotionally, interrupt each other, laugh, change topics, and use many small expressions that textbooks rarely teach. So when someone learns English only through textbooks, the brain builds knowledge but not speed. And without speed, conversations feel stressful. During my first weeks working in America, I noticed something interesting about my co-workers. Many of them did not use complicated English. Their sentences were actually very simple. But they spoke confidently. One co-worker once said something that stayed in my mind. Don't worry about perfect English. Just talk. At first, that advice sounded too simple to be useful. But later I realized something important. Simple English is not weak English. Simple English is efficient communication. Most daily conversations in the United States are built with short sentences. People focus more on clarity than complexity. The goal is connection, not perfection. This idea slowly changed the way I practiced English. Instead of trying to memorize more grammar rules, I started observing real conversations around me. At the grocery store. At work. In the park. Even on the bus. Americans often communicate using patterns that repeat again and again. Hey, how's it going? Not bad. Pretty good. Busy day. Yeah, kind of. These phrases may look small, but they create the rhythm of conversation. They help people connect quickly without thinking too much. Once I started paying attention to these patterns, something surprising happened. Listening became easier. Because instead of trying to understand every word, my brain started recognizing familiar conversation shapes. Language researchers call this pattern recognition, and it is one of the fastest ways the brain learns a language. Think about how children learn to speak. They don't memorize grammar books. They hear patterns again and again until those patterns become automatic. In other words, repetition creates fluency. So I began a small personal experiment. Every day, I would learn just a few simple English sentences from real situations. Not from textbooks, but from life. If a coworker said something useful, I remembered it. If a cashier used a helpful phrase, I repeated it quietly later. If someone asked a question, I practiced answering that same question the next day. This method felt natural. And more importantly, it felt possible. Because learning 10 complex grammar rules in one day feels overwhelming. But learning 3 real-life sentences feels manageable. And here's something interesting about the brain. Small daily improvements create motivation. Large difficult goals often create fear. Within a few weeks, my confidence slowly grew. Conversations were still slow, but they were happening more often. Instead of avoiding speaking, I began looking for opportunities to practice. A short comment at the grocery store. A small conversation with a neighbor. A quick question at work. Every conversation was like a small workout for the brain. And just like physical exercise, repetition builds strength. At the same time, something else started happening. People began remembering me. The barista at a nearby coffee shop recognized my face. A neighbor started greeting me every morning. Co-workers began including me in small conversations. These moments may seem unimportant, but they create something powerful: community. And community often leads to opportunity. Around that time, a new idea slowly began forming in my mind. It wasn't a big plan yet. Just a small observation about daily life in the neighborhood. Many people around me were busy. They worked long hours. They needed simple services that saved time. And one evening, while watching customers at a small local shop, a question quietly appeared in my head. What if a small business could help people here? The idea was still blurry. My English was still improving. My confidence was still growing. But the thought stayed in my mind. Because America has a culture that encourages small businesses. Local communities often support new ideas, especially when the person behind the idea works hard. However, starting a business requires more than an idea. It requires communication, conversations, trust. And at that moment in my journey, my English was still far from perfect. So the real question became this: could someone with simple English build something meaningful in America? At the time, the answer felt uncertain. But something unexpected was about to happen. Because one ordinary conversation with a stranger would soon change how I thought about both English and opportunity. And that moment would slowly open the door to something much bigger than I imagined. A business, a community, and a story that would continue far beyond that small neighborhood grocery store. The first real American conversation. Something interesting about America becomes clear very quickly once you start living there. Conversations happen everywhere. In stores, on sidewalks, in elevators, in coffee shops. Small talk is almost like social oxygen. People exchange a few words, smile, and continue their day. For someone still learning English, those moments can feel both exciting and terrifying. During my first months in the United States, I noticed that many conversations happened suddenly. No preparation. No warning. A stranger could say something at any moment. And when that happened, my brain had to react fast. Fast was not my strength yet. One afternoon after work, I stopped at a small coffee shop near the neighborhood where I lived. It was not a fancy place. Just a quiet shop with wooden tables, soft music, and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. Coffee shops in America are interesting places. They are not only for drinking coffee. People work there, study there, meet friends there, and sometimes just sit quietly with a laptop. That day, I ordered the cheapest drink on the menu. Small coffee, please. The cashier smiled and gave me the cup. My English sentence was short but correct. That already felt like a small success. I sat down near the window and watched people walking outside. Some were carrying laptops. Some were talking on phones. Some were walking dogs. Life in America often moves quickly, but coffee shops slow things down. About 10 minutes later, someone sat at the table next to mine. He looked like he was in his mid-30s. Casual clothes, a laptop, and the relaxed confidence that many Americans seem to have. He opened his computer and began typing. I tried to focus on my coffee. But then something happened that still makes me smile when I remember it. He looked over and said, very casually, "Working or relaxing?" Just 3 words. But the question arrived suddenly, and my brain needed a second to process it. Working, or relaxing. Simple words. Simple grammar. But answering felt like solving a puzzle under pressure. For a moment I considered pretending not to hear. Many language learners know this strategy. Silence can feel safer than speaking. But something inside me remembered the promise I had made to myself. Simple English. Every day. So I answered slowly. Relaxing today. Work finished. My grammar was not perfect, but the message was clear. He nodded and smiled. Nice. Long day. The conversation continued. We talked about work, the weather, and the neighborhood. His name was Daniel. He lived nearby and often came to that coffee shop to finish work on his laptop. One interesting thing I noticed during that conversation was how patient he was. When my sentences were slow, he waited. When my words were slightly incorrect, he still understood. This is something many people misunderstand about communication in the United States. Most people do not expect perfect English. They expect effort. Effort shows sincerity. Effort shows respect. Effort shows that you are trying to connect. After a few minutes of talking, Daniel asked a question that surprised me. So what brought you to America? That question appears often in conversations here. The country is built by immigrants, travelers, students, and workers from many places. Stories are part of daily life. I answered honestly. I want to build a better life. Maybe start small business someday. The words were simple, but they carried a dream. Daniel leaned back slightly and looked thoughtful. That's cool, he said. America's actually pretty good for that. Those words stayed in my mind. America's pretty good for that. Starting a business had always felt like a distant idea. Something for the future. Something that required perfect language, big money, and powerful connections. But hearing someone say it so casually made the dream feel slightly more realistic. During that conversation, Daniel also said something that completely changed the way I thought about English. You know, he said, most people don't care if your English is perfect. If they understand you, that's enough. This idea seems obvious. But when someone is learning a language, perfection often becomes an invisible barrier. People wait until their grammar improves. They wait until their vocabulary grows. They wait until their accent sounds better. And during that waiting time, they avoid speaking. But real improvement only happens through speaking. That short coffee shop conversation lasted maybe 15 minutes. But it felt like an hour of learning. Because something important happened. For the first time, I had a real conversation in America, not just a short exchange at a store or a quick greeting. When Daniel finished his coffee, he packed his laptop and stood up. Before leaving, he said something simple. Good luck with the business idea. Then he added one more sentence. You'd be surprised how many people will support you if you work hard. That sentence stayed in my mind long after he left. At the time, I thought it was just friendly encouragement. But later I would realize something surprising. That coffee shop conversation was the beginning of something much bigger. Because the idea of starting a business would slowly grow stronger. And even more interesting. The people who helped the most were not close friends. They were strangers. People from the same neighborhood. Customers. Neighbors. And individuals who simply believed that effort deserved a chance. But before any of that happened, something else needed to change first. My confidence with English. Because without communication, even the best ideas stay trapped inside the mind. And the next turning point in my journey would come from someone unexpected. Another stranger. Someone who didn't just listen to my English, but actually believed in my potential. The stranger who changed my confidence. Confidence in a new language rarely appears suddenly. It usually grows quietly, through small moments that seem unimportant at the time. A short conversation. A kind smile. A stranger who listens without rushing away. In America, those small moments happen more often than people expect. A few weeks after that coffee shop conversation, my daily routine had become predictable. Work during the day, short English practice in the evening, and occasional visits to the same neighborhood places. One of those places was a small weekend farmers market not far from where I lived. Farmers markets in many American cities are interesting places. Local farmers, small food vendors, handmade products, flowers, bread, fruit, and music sometimes playing in the background. Families walk slowly between the stalls, talking, tasting samples, enjoying the relaxed atmosphere. For someone learning English, it is also a perfect place to listen to natural conversations. People speak casually there. No rush. No pressure. That Saturday morning, the sky was bright and the air felt warmer than usual. I walked through the market mostly observing people and listening to how they spoke. One stand caught my attention. It was selling homemade bread and small pastries. The smell was incredible. Fresh bread has a way of stopping people in their tracks. Behind the table was an older woman, maybe in her late 50s. She greeted every customer with the same warm smile. Good morning. Would you like to try a sample? Samples are common at markets in America. Small pieces of food offered for free so customers can taste before buying. When it was my turn, she offered a small piece of bread. Fresh this morning, she said. I took a bite. It was simple, but very good. She asked the usual question vendors ask. What do you think? My brain prepared a sentence quickly. Very good. I like it. Again, not perfect English, but clear enough. She smiled. Thanks. Are you new around here? That question appears often in American conversations. Communities are curious about newcomers. Yes, I said. I moved here recently. She nodded with interest. Welcome to the neighborhood. Then she asked another question. Where are you from? For a moment, we talked about countries, weather differences, and food. Conversations like this often happen naturally when people meet someone from another culture. But something interesting happened during this conversation. Instead of rushing to the next customer, she kept talking with me. Slowly. Patiently. As if my slower English didn't matter. Then she asked something unexpected. So what do you do? I explained my job in simple sentences. My grammar was basic, but she understood. Then she asked another question. What do you want to do in the future? That question made me hesitate for a moment. Dreams feel vulnerable when spoken out loud, especially in a new language. But I answered honestly. I want to start small business someday. She looked at me for a second, then smiled again. You should. 2 words. But sometimes 2 words carry a lot of meaning. Many immigrants arrive in the United States with similar hopes. The culture here encourages entrepreneurship, small businesses, local services, and creative ideas. Communities often support people who are trying to build something. Still, hearing encouragement from a stranger felt unexpected. She introduced herself. Her name was Margaret. Margaret had been running that small bread stand for more than 10 years. Every weekend she baked bread early in the morning and sold it at the farmer's market. It started as a hobby, she told me. Then she laughed. Now it is my little business. This conversation opened my eyes to something important about American culture. Many businesses here begin very small. A home kitchen. A garage. A weekend stand. A simple idea. People test their ideas slowly. If the community likes it, the business grows. Margaret explained that many vendors at the market started exactly the same way. People around here love supporting local businesses, she said. That sentence stayed in my mind. Supporting local businesses. For someone dreaming about starting a small company, that idea felt encouraging. But something even more valuable happened during that conversation. Margaret did something simple but powerful. She asked me to explain my business idea. At first I felt nervous. My English vocabulary about business was limited. Explaining an idea felt complicated. But she listened patiently. When I struggled to find a word, she waited. When my sentences were slow, she smiled. And when I finally finished describing my small idea, she nodded thoughtfully. You know, she said, that could actually work here. Those words felt surprisingly powerful. Language learning researchers often explain that confidence grows when learners experience successful communication. Not perfect communication, successful communication. That means the message was understood. The connection happened. And that day, something important happened in my mind. My English was still simple. But my ideas could still be shared. My words were slow. But people were still listening. Before I left the market, Margaret said something that later became one of the most important lessons in my journey. People don't expect you to be perfect, she said. They expect you to be real. Real effort. Real work. Real ideas. That afternoon, walking home from the farmer's market, I noticed something had quietly changed. For the first time since arriving in America, the dream of starting a business no longer felt impossible. It felt distant, but possible. And the most surprising part? The first person who believed in that idea was not a business expert, not a wealthy investor, not a close friend. It was a woman selling bread at a weekend market. A stranger. But that would not be the last time a stranger believed in me. Because soon, something unexpected would begin happening. More conversations. More support. And the small business idea that once lived quietly in my mind would slowly begin turning into something real. But before that could happen, another lesson about life in America was waiting. A lesson about everyday conversations. And how they can completely change the direction of a person's future. Learning English through everyday life. Most people imagine that learning English happens at a desk. A notebook open. Grammar rules everywhere. Long vocabulary lists waiting to be memorized. But something very different started happening to me in America. English slowly began teaching itself. Through everyday life. Not through textbooks. Through people. Through small daily situations that appeared without warning. After my conversation with Margaret at the farmer's market, something inside my mindset quietly shifted. Instead of thinking of English as a school subject, I started seeing it as a daily tool. A tool for connection. A tool for opportunity. And sometimes, a tool for opening doors you didn't even know existed. One interesting fact about language learning is that the brain remembers words much better when they are connected to real experiences. Scientists call this context learning. When language appears inside real situations, the brain stores it with emotion, images, and memories. In simple terms, real life helps English stick. So I began practicing in the most natural classroom possible, the neighborhood around me. Morning walks became listening practice. At the small grocery store, I listened carefully to how customers spoke with cashiers. Paper or plastic? Receipt in the bag? Have a nice day. These phrases appeared again and again. After hearing them several times, my brain began recognizing them instantly. Repetition builds familiarity. Familiarity builds speed. Soon those phrases felt normal instead of confusing. At a nearby laundromat, I overheard conversations between people waiting for their clothes to finish washing. Most discussions were simple. Complaints about weather, work schedules, or sports games. But something interesting about American conversation style became clearer every day. People use short sentences. They speak directly. And they often repeat similar patterns. For example, one phrase I heard often was, "Pretty busy today." Not, "Are you experiencing a busy day today?" Just, "Pretty busy today." The grammar is simple, but the communication works perfectly. Observing these patterns became one of the most effective learning methods I had ever used. Instead of memorizing complicated structures, I started collecting real-life English sentences like small tools. Each sentence was useful. Each sentence had a purpose. And slowly, those tools built confidence. Another place where I learned a surprising amount of English was the neighborhood park. In the evenings, families often gathered there. Parents watched children play. Dogs chased balls across the grass. Teenagers talked loudly about school or weekend plans. Listening to natural conversations there was like watching a live language classroom. But something else began happening during those visits. People started recognizing me. At first, it was just small greetings. A nod. A short "hey." Then conversations began growing slightly longer. "Nice weather today." "Yeah, finally warmer." "How long you lived here?" Little by little, those simple exchanges created something powerful: familiarity. Humans are social creatures. Once people see the same face many times, curiosity naturally grows. They begin asking questions. And questions create conversations. Conversations create relationships. And relationships often create opportunities. During this time, I also started thinking more seriously about the small business idea that had been forming in my mind. The idea itself was not complicated. It was based on something simple I had noticed about the community. People in the neighborhood were busy. Very busy. Many worked long hours and valued convenience. Small services that saved time were extremely popular. The United States actually has a strong culture of small local businesses. coffee shops, food trucks, repair services, tutoring, home services. Many of these start with just one person and a simple idea. But even small businesses require one important skill: communication. Customers need to understand what you offer. They need to trust you. They need to feel comfortable speaking with you. And for someone still learning English, that can feel intimidating. There were moments when I wondered whether my language skills were good enough. But then I remembered something Margaret said at the farmer's market. People don't expect you to be perfect. They expect you to be real. That sentence returned to my mind many times. Real effort often matters more than perfect grammar. Real honesty builds trust faster than complicated vocabulary. And slowly, the community around me was teaching me something valuable. English was not just a language. It was a bridge. Every conversation was a small step across that bridge. Every friendly neighbor was another connection. And every day of practice made the next conversation slightly easier. One evening in the park, something happened that made me realize just how much progress had quietly happened. A man walking his dog stopped near the bench where I was sitting. His dog ran happily across the grass, chasing a tennis ball. He looked at me and asked casually, "You live around here?" Without thinking too much, I answered naturally, "Yeah, a few months now." The sentence came out smoothly. No long pause. No heavy translation. Just communication. That moment felt small, but inside my mind it felt like a milestone. Because for the first time, English responded automatically. That is the moment language learners are waiting for. The moment when the brain stops translating every word. But that evening conversation did not end there. The man introduced himself and asked what I did for work. Eventually the topic shifted to something interesting. Small businesses in the neighborhood. Local services. And suddenly, the idea that had been quietly growing in my mind found its way into the conversation. I mentioned it carefully. A small business idea. Just an idea. Nothing serious yet. The man listened with curiosity. Then he said something that would soon become very important. "You know, people around here like supporting new businesses." Another stranger. Another moment of encouragement. And slowly, a pattern was forming. Strangers were not just listening. They were believing. But the most surprising part of the journey had not happened yet. Because very soon, one unexpected conversation would turn that small idea into the first real step towards starting a business in America. Cultural lessons I didn't expect. Living in America teaches many lessons that textbooks never mention. Language is only one part of the experience. Culture, habits, and everyday behavior also shape how people communicate. And sometimes those differences feel surprising. During my first months in the United States, I slowly began noticing small cultural patterns that helped me understand conversations better. These patterns were not about vocabulary or grammar. They were about how people interact. Understanding that changed the way I listened to English. One evening after work, I returned to the same neighborhood park where I often practiced listening to conversations. The sky was turning orange as the sun slowly disappeared behind rows of houses. A group of neighbors were sitting on folding chairs near the playground. Someone had brought a small speaker playing quiet music. A few children were running around with soccer balls. Moments like this show a simple truth about many American neighborhoods. People enjoy casual social time.
No formal invitations. No complicated planning.
Just neighbors relaxing together after a long day. I sat nearby on a bench, listening. One interesting thing became clear very quickly. American conversations often sound informal and relaxed, even when people have just met. There is a cultural comfort with speaking directly but politely. For example, people ask questions easily. Where do you work? How long you lived here? What brought you to this city? At first, these questions surprised me. In some cultures, personal questions appear only after a long friendship. But in many American communities, curiosity is a way of building connection. Eventually someone noticed me sitting nearby. A man waved casually.
Hey, come join us.
That small invitation felt unexpected. I hesitated for a moment, but then remembered my promise to keep practicing English whenever possible.
So I walked over.
Introductions began. Names were exchanged. People asked where I was from. A few jokes were made about the weather changing every week. The conversation was simple, but it revealed something important about American communication style. People here appreciate authenticity. You don't need complicated sentences to join a conversation. You only need honesty and a willingness to participate. One neighbor asked what kind of work I did. I explained my job briefly. Then another question appeared. So what do you want to do long term? That question had started appearing more often lately. Maybe it was the way Americans naturally think about goals. Many people here like talking about future plans. So again, I shared the small idea that had been quietly growing in my mind.
Starting a small business. Just a simple service for the neighborhood.
I explained it slowly. My sentences were not elegant, but they were clear enough. When I finished, something interesting happened.
Nobody laughed.
Nobody doubted it. Instead, several people nodded thoughtfully. One woman said something that surprised me. You know, small businesses are the heart of neighborhoods like this. Another neighbor agreed. Yeah, people love supporting local stuff. Their reactions revealed another cultural pattern in America: community support for entrepreneurship. Even small ideas often receive encouragement. Of course, encouragement does not guarantee success. But it creates something valuable: confidence. Confidence is important not only in business, but also in language learning. Psychologists often explain that the brain performs better when it feels safe. When people feel accepted, they take more risks. And language learning requires risk. Every sentence spoken in a new language is a small risk. The speaker accepts the possibility of mistakes in exchange for communication. That evening conversation lasted maybe 40 minutes. During that time, I spoke more English than I had spoken during many entire weeks before. Slow English.
Simple English.
But real English. Something else became clear during those conversations. People cared more about the idea I was sharing than the grammar I used to describe it. That realization removed a heavy weight from my mind. Perfection was not the goal. Connection was the goal. When the conversation ended, one neighbor said something that stayed in my memory. If you ever start that business, let us know. It sounded like a casual comment. But inside my mind, it felt like a door opening slightly. Because suddenly the idea was no longer private. Other people knew about it. And interestingly, they seemed interested. Walking home that evening, I began thinking about something important. For months I had been waiting for my English to become good enough. But what if that moment never arrives? Language learning is a long journey. Even people who live in America for many years continue improving.
Waiting for perfection might mean waiting forever.
Instead, perhaps the better approach was simple. Start with what you have. Use the English you know today. Improve along the way. This idea changed my mindset completely. Rather than postponing my business idea until some imaginary future when my English became flawless, I started wondering something new. What if the business itself could help improve my English? Talking with customers. Explaining services. Answering questions. Every interaction could become practice. In fact, running a small business might become the most powerful English classroom imaginable. But one problem still existed. An idea alone is not enough to start a business. Resources are needed. Advice is needed. And sometimes, belief from other people. At that time, I didn't know where that belief would come from. But something surprising was about to happen. Very soon, another stranger, someone I had never met before, would hear my idea for the first time. And that moment would quietly become the beginning of the most important chapter in this journey. The chapter where the idea stopped being just a dream and slowly started becoming reality.
The small business idea.
Ideas rarely arrive with loud music and flashing lights. Most of the time, they appear quietly, almost like a whisper inside the mind. At first they seem small, maybe even unimportant. But sometimes, if you keep thinking about them long enough, those small ideas slowly grow into something real. That is exactly how my business idea started. Not in a big office. Not during an important meeting. Just during everyday life in a normal American neighborhood. By this time, my English had improved a little. Not perfect, of course. My sentences were still simple, and sometimes I needed a few seconds to organize my thoughts. But something had definitely changed. I was no longer afraid to speak. And that change happened because of one important realization. Simple English works. Everyday conversations with neighbors, small talk in the park, quick chats at coffee shops. These moments had slowly built confidence. Instead of waiting for perfect grammar, I focused on clear communication. And the more I practiced, the more I noticed something interesting about the neighborhood around me. People were busy. Very busy. Early in the morning, cars left driveways quickly as people rushed to work. In the evenings, families returned home tired. Weekends were often filled with errands, groceries, cleaning, and small tasks that took up time. One afternoon while walking past several houses, I noticed something simple but important. Many small household tasks were being delayed. Yards that needed attention. Packages waiting at doors. Simple jobs that people didn't always have time to handle immediately. That observation sparked a thought. What if there was a small service business that helped people with everyday tasks?
Nothing complicated.
Just reliable help for simple things. In America, this type of business actually exists in many forms. Neighborhood services are extremely common. Lawn care, cleaning services, delivery assistance, home repairs. Many successful businesses start with simple solutions to everyday problems. But having an idea and acting on it are two very different things. For several weeks, the thought stayed inside my mind. I kept observing people, watching how the neighborhood worked, listening to conversations about daily life. And every time I noticed another example of people being too busy for small tasks, the idea grew slightly stronger. Eventually, I decided to do something that felt a little scary. I started mentioning the idea in conversations. Not as a big announcement. Just casually. If someone offered help with small neighborhood tasks, would people use it? The responses surprised me. Many people said yes. Some even began suggesting other small services that could help the community. Those conversations revealed something interesting about American culture. People like practical solutions. If a service saves time and is reliable, many customers are willing to support it, especially when the business is local. But there was still a problem. Even though the idea sounded promising, starting a business still felt intimidating. Business requires planning. It requires money. It requires confidence. And most importantly for me, it requires communication. Talking with customers. Explaining services. Answering questions. All of these things require English. For a moment, doubt returned. Was my English strong enough to handle these conversations? Then I remembered something Margaret had said weeks earlier at the farmer's market. People don't expect you to be perfect. They expect you to be real. That sentence returned to my mind again. Real effort. Real service. Real honesty. Maybe those qualities mattered more than perfect grammar. A few days later, something unexpected happened. I was sitting in the same coffee shop where I had met Daniel weeks earlier. The shop had become one of my favorite places for observing conversations and practicing listening. While I was thinking about my idea, the barista behind the counter recognized me. "Hey, you're here a lot lately," he joked. I smiled and nodded. We started chatting casually. His name was Alex, and he had been working there for several years. Eventually, the conversation moved to the usual topic. What do you do for work? After explaining my job, I mentioned the small business idea. Alex listened carefully. Then he said something that surprised me. "You know, people around here love supporting small local businesses." That phrase again. Supporting local businesses. I had heard it several times already from different people. Then Alex added something else. "My friend started a small service business last year. Just him and a truck. Now he's doing really well." Hearing that story made the idea feel slightly more realistic. Because suddenly I wasn't imagining something impossible. I was imagining something that other people had already done. Psychologists often explain that the brain becomes more confident when it sees examples of success. If someone else has done something before, the mind begins believing it might also be possible. But even with encouragement, starting still felt like a big step. Ideas are safe inside the mind. Reality requires action. Walking home that evening, I kept asking myself a simple question. What is the smallest possible first step? Starting a business does not always require a huge beginning. Many entrepreneurs recommend something called testing an idea. Testing means starting small. Trying the service with just a few customers. Learning what works. Improving slowly. And that night, for the first time, I began thinking seriously about taking that first step. Not a big launch.
Not a complicated plan. Just a simple beginning.
But something even more surprising was about to happen. Because very soon, the people who would help the most in this journey would appear from unexpected places. Neighbors, customers,
And complete strangers.
strangers who would believe in the idea before I fully believed in it myself. And that support would soon push the small business idea out of my mind and into the real world.
When strangers started believing.
The moment when an idea becomes real rarely happens all at once. It usually begins with a small decision.
A tiny action.
A quiet step forward that almost nobody notices. For me, that step happened on a calm Saturday morning. The neighborhood was peaceful. Sunlight was slowly warming the streets, and people were beginning their weekend routines. Some were walking dogs. Others were washing cars in their driveways.
Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Ordinary life.
But inside my mind, something unusual was happening. For weeks, the small business idea had been moving in circles in my thoughts. I had talked about it with neighbors, mentioned it casually in conversations, observed how people reacted, and the reactions were surprisingly positive. But thinking and doing are two different worlds. That morning, I decided to do something simple. I wrote a short message. Not a complicated advertisement. Not a professional business announcement. Just a simple note explaining a few services I could offer in the neighborhood. Helping with small household tasks.
Yard clean up.
Simple deliveries. Small jobs that busy people often postpone. The message was written in very simple English. Short sentences. Clear words.
Nothing fancy.
I printed a few copies and walked through the neighborhood, placing them carefully on community boards and a few allowed notice areas. While doing this, I felt something interesting inside my chest. Nervous excitement. Starting something new always creates that feeling. Part fear, part hope. After placing the last notice, I walked home and tried not to think about it too much. Realistically, I expected nothing to happen. Maybe someone would call in a week. Maybe nobody would respond at all. But life sometimes surprises us when we least expect it. Later that same afternoon, my phone rang.
Unknown number.
My heart started beating slightly faster. I answered carefully. Hello. A friendly voice responded. Hi, I saw your note about helping with small jobs. For a moment, my brain paused. Someone actually called. The man explained that he needed help moving some heavy boxes from his garage.
Nothing complicated.
Just an hour or two of work. My English was still simple, but we understood each other clearly. We agreed on a time for the next day. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment. That small phone conversation felt surprisingly important. Because suddenly the idea had moved from imagination to action. The next day I arrived at the address he gave me. It was only a few streets away. A normal suburban house with a small front yard. The man greeted me at the door. Thanks for coming, he said. His name was Robert. He showed me the boxes that needed moving and explained where they should go. The job was simple and finished quickly. But the interesting part was the conversation that happened afterward. Robert asked how long I had lived in the neighborhood, where I was from,
how the business idea started.
I explained everything slowly.
My journey to America.
My efforts to improve English. My hope to build something small but meaningful. He listened carefully. Then he said something that stayed in my mind.
You know, everyone starts somewhere.
Those words may sound ordinary, but in that moment they carried encouragement.
Starting something new always feels uncertain.
But hearing someone acknowledge that beginning makes the path feel less lonely. After finishing the work, Robert paid me and added something unexpected. If you ever need a reference, feel free to mention my name. A reference. In business, references are powerful. They create trust. They tell other customers that someone else has already had a good experience. And trust is the foundation of any small business. Walking home after that job, something felt different inside my mind. The idea was no longer theoretical. It had produced its first real customer. But the surprises were not finished yet. 2 days later, another phone call arrived. This time it was a woman who had heard about my service from Robert. Word had already started spreading. That moment revealed something important about communities in America. Recommendations travel quickly. When people trust a service, they often share it with neighbors and friends. This process is sometimes called word-of-mouth marketing, and it is one of the most powerful ways small businesses grow. Without advertisements. Without expensive campaigns. Just people talking to each other. Over the next few weeks, a few more small jobs appeared. Nothing huge. Helping move furniture. Cleaning a small yard. Delivering a package for an elderly neighbor. But each job brought something valuable. Experience. Confidence. And most importantly, conversation. Every customer interaction became English practice. Explaining services. Listening to requests. Answering questions. These real-life conversations improved my English faster than any classroom could. Because they were connected to real purpose.
Real communication.
Real people. But the most surprising part of the journey was still unfolding. The business was still tiny. The income was small. Yet something remarkable was beginning to happen. Strangers, people I had never met before, were slowly placing trust in me. Trust in my effort.
Trust in my honesty.
Trust in the idea. And as that trust grew, something else began growing alongside it. Confidence. Not just confidence in business. Confidence in language. Confidence in the future. But life, of course, never moves in a perfectly smooth line. Just as things were beginning to improve, a much bigger challenge was about to appear. A challenge that would test both the business and my belief in the journey. And that difficult chapter would soon reveal whether this small dream could truly survive in America.
Love, family, and motivation.
Success stories often focus on business strategies, money, or clever ideas. But the truth is simpler. Behind many small businesses, there is something more personal driving the effort. Family. Love. Responsibility. During the early days of my small service business, life in America was still very simple. The jobs were small. The income was modest. Some weeks there were several customers. Other weeks were quiet. But something important was slowly changing in my personal life. Until that point, most of my journey had been about survival and improvement.
Learning English.
Understanding American culture. Trying to build something stable. Then one unexpected connection began to change the emotional side of the journey.
It started with another ordinary conversation.
One afternoon, I returned to the same coffee shop that had quietly become a place of practice for my English. The familiar smell of coffee and soft music filled the room. A few people were typing on laptops. Others were reading quietly. While waiting in line, I noticed someone I had seen several times before. She often came in the afternoons, usually with a book or a notebook. Sometimes she sat near the window writing for long periods of time. That day the shop was busy, and the only empty seat left was the chair across from her table. I walked over carefully.
"Is this seat free?"
I asked. She looked up, smiled, and nodded.
"Yeah, go ahead."
Moments like that are simple, but they often lead to unexpected conversations. At first we sat quietly, both focusing on our drinks. But eventually she noticed the small notebook I was using to write down English phrases I heard during the day. Curiosity is common in American conversation culture. "What are you writing?" she asked. I explained that I was collecting useful English sentences from daily life. Simple expressions people use in normal conversations. Her reaction surprised me. "That's actually a really smart way to learn," she said. Her name was Emily. She worked remotely and often used the coffee shop as a quiet place to write. The conversation grew naturally from there. We talked about language learning, travel, and life in the neighborhood. My English was still simple, but the conversation felt comfortable. At some point she asked a question I had heard before. "So what do you do for work?" I explained my small service business idea and the few jobs I had already completed. Her reaction was thoughtful. "That's a good idea for this area," she said. Then she asked something that made the conversation more personal.
"What made you want to start something like that?"
That question required a deeper answer. I explained that moving to America had been both exciting and challenging. Learning English, understanding culture, building a life, it all required patience. Starting a business felt like a way to create independence, to build something meaningful, to belong. Emily listened carefully. Then she said something that made me realize an important truth about motivation. Having a reason makes everything easier. Those words stayed in my mind. Motivation becomes stronger when people feel they are building something bigger than themselves. During the following weeks, Emily and I continued seeing each other occasionally at the coffee shop. Conversations became longer. English practice became more natural. And slowly, friendship began growing. One interesting thing about relationships in America is that many begin through casual conversation. Shared spaces like parks, coffee shops, and community events often create opportunities for people to connect. Over time, those small conversations became something deeper.
Encouragement.
Support.
Understanding.
Emily often asked how the small business was going. Whenever I shared updates about new customers or challenges, she listened with genuine interest. "You're building something," she said once. "That takes courage." Those words carried weight. Because building a business, even a very small one, can sometimes feel lonely. Many decisions happen quietly. Many doubts stay inside the mind. Having someone who believes in your effort makes those challenges easier. Psychologists often explain that social support plays a major role in motivation and persistence. When people feel supported, their resilience increases. They are more willing to continue during difficult moments. That support was slowly becoming part of my journey. But the influence went even deeper. Emily also helped me practice English in a natural way. Instead of formal lessons, our conversations became informal language training. She would gently correct small mistakes, suggest better words, explain expressions people commonly use in everyday conversation. Learning in that way felt natural and comfortable. Instead of memorizing grammar rules, I was experiencing the language through real interaction. And gradually, something surprising happened. English started feeling less like a challenge and more like a tool.
A tool for communication.
A tool for relationships. A tool for building the life I wanted. Meanwhile, the small business continued growing slowly. A few new customers appeared through word-of-mouth recommendations. Each job improved both my confidence and my English. The progress was not dramatic, but it was steady. And sometimes steady progress is the most powerful kind. One evening while walking home from the coffee shop, I realized something important about the journey. When I first arrived in America, the dream had been simple: survive, learn English, maybe build something small. Now the dream was becoming more meaningful. It was no longer only about business. It was about building a life. A life that included relationships, community, and purpose. But every story includes moments of difficulty. And just as things were beginning to feel stable, a much harder challenge was approaching. A challenge that would test the strength of the business and the strength of my determination. The next chapter of the journey would reveal whether the small dream could survive when things stopped going smoothly. Because in America, just like anywhere else, success often requires passing through a difficult year.
The hardest year.
Every journey has a chapter that feels heavier than the others. A period when progress slows down, doubts return, and the future becomes difficult to see clearly. For me, that chapter arrived about a year after the small business began. Until then, things had been slowly improving. The number of customers had grown little by little. Most jobs were still small, helping with yard work, moving furniture, running simple errands, but they were consistent enough to keep the business alive. More importantly, each customer interaction improved my English. Conversations became easier. Listening became faster. Simple sentences started coming naturally. For the first time since arriving in America, life felt stable. And then something unexpected happened. The number of calls suddenly dropped. At first, I didn't worry too much. Small businesses often experience slow weeks. Some months are busy. Others are quiet. But when 2 weeks passed with almost no new jobs, a familiar feeling returned. Uncertainty. Without customers, there was no income. Without income, the future of the business felt fragile. Running a business, even a very small one, means living with risk. Unlike a regular job, there is no guaranteed paycheck. Success depends on demand, reputation, and sometimes pure luck. During that period, I began noticing something else. A few new competitors had appeared in nearby neighborhoods. Other people were offering similar services. Some had trucks, better tools, or more experience. Competition is normal in business, especially in the United States where entrepreneurship is common. But when your business is still small, competition can feel intimidating. For several evenings, I sat quietly at the same coffee shop where many earlier conversations had taken place. The place that once felt like a classroom for learning English now became a place for thinking. Questions filled my mind. Was the idea strong enough? Was my English good enough to compete? Had the early success simply been luck? Doubt is a powerful emotion. When it appears, the brain begins imagining worst-case scenarios. Psychologists often explain that humans have something called negativity bias. The mind naturally focuses more on problems than on successes. 10 positive experiences can happen, but one negative event often feels stronger. That bias was working inside my mind. Instead of remembering the many satisfied customers I had helped, I was focusing on the recent silence. One evening Emily noticed my quiet mood while we were sitting at the coffee shop. "You seem distracted," she said. I explained the situation. Fewer customers. More competition. Uncertainty about the future. She listened carefully, then asked a simple question. "What made people call you in the first place?" The answer seemed obvious. Trust. Neighbors had recommended me. Customers had shared positive experiences with others. Word of mouth had built the business. Emily nodded. "So the real question isn't whether people need the service," she said. "The question is how to remind them you're here." That idea was surprisingly helpful. Sometimes when challenges appear, the solution is not to quit. The solution is to adjust the strategy. The next few days became a period of learning. I spent time observing how other small businesses in the neighborhood promoted their services. Many used simple methods. Community boards. Local online groups. Friendly conversations with neighbors. Nothing complicated. Just visibility. So I decided to take action again. I updated the small service notices and placed them again in several community areas. I also joined a few neighborhood online groups where residents sometimes asked for help with small tasks. Writing messages in English still required effort, but it had become much easier than before. Years earlier, those messages might have taken hours to write. Now they took minutes. Language improvement had quietly happened through hundreds of real conversations. Within a week, something encouraging occurred. A new customer contacted me through one of those community groups. Then another. And another. The jobs were still modest, but the flow had returned. That difficult period taught an important lesson about both business and language learning. Progress is rarely a straight line. There are periods of growth, periods of stability, and periods that feel like setbacks. But setbacks are often temporary if effort continues. Another interesting thing happened during that challenging year. The community support became even stronger. Some earlier customers recommended my services to friends. A neighbor mentioned my work in a local conversation group. Small acts of support appeared from different directions. Once again, strangers were playing an unexpected role in the story. People who had only known me for a short time were helping keep the business alive. Their support revealed something important about communities in America. Hard work is respected. And when people see someone genuinely trying, they often offer help. Slowly, the difficult year began turning into a period of growth. not only for the business, but also for my confidence. Because overcoming challenges builds something deeper than success alone. Resilience. The ability to continue even when the path becomes uncertain. And that resilience would soon lead to the most surprising chapter of the journey. Because after surviving the hardest year, something unexpected was about to happen. The small business that once started with a few handwritten notes would suddenly begin growing faster than I ever imagined. And the people responsible for that growth would not be investors or business experts. They would be the same people who had been quietly supporting the journey from the very beginning. Strangers. Neighbors. A community that believed effort deserved a chance. When the community started talking, the hardest year had passed. The business did not suddenly become huge. There were no dramatic success stories or viral moments. But something important had changed. People in the neighborhood were starting to talk about the service. At first, I didn't notice it clearly. Most days still looked simple. Wake up early. Check messages. Respond to customers. Do small jobs around the community. But one small moment revealed that something bigger was happening. One Saturday morning I arrived at a customer's house to help move several heavy boxes into a garage. It was a quiet residential street with tall trees and clean sidewalks. The customer opened the door and smiled. "Oh good," he said. "You're the guy my neighbor recommended." That sentence may sound ordinary, but it meant something powerful. Recommendation. Word of mouth. The most valuable marketing in small business. In America, many small businesses grow not because of advertisements, but because of trust between neighbors. If someone does a good job, people talk. And when people talk, opportunities multiply. After finishing that job, the customer asked a casual question. "So how long have you been doing this?" "About a year," I answered. He nodded. "Well, you've built a good reputation around here." That comment surprised me. Reputation. I had never thought about the business in that way. I was simply trying to do every job carefully and communicate clearly with customers. But apparently those small efforts had been noticed. During the following weeks, similar conversations began happening more often. A customer would say, "My friend told me about you." Or, "My neighbor said you helped them last month." Each time I heard those words, the same realization appeared. The business was no longer just an idea. It had become part of the community. At the same time, something interesting was happening with my English. Earlier in the journey, every conversation required concentration. I had to think about vocabulary, sentence structure, and pronunciation. Now conversations felt natural. Customers spoke quickly, but I understood most of what they said. I could explain services clearly. I could ask questions confidently. Language had quietly transformed from a challenge into a working tool. This is one of the most effective ways to learn English. Real-life practice. Many language experts explain that the brain learns faster when language is connected to meaningful situations. When communication has a purpose, memory becomes stronger. Every customer conversation had been a language lesson. Every job had been a speaking exercise. Every question had been listening practice. Without realizing it, I had been living inside a full-time English classroom. One afternoon something happened that made the progress even more clear. Emily and I were sitting at the coffee shop again, the same place where many earlier conversations had begun. She noticed something during one of my phone calls with a customer. After I finished the call, she smiled. "You realize your English sounds completely different now, right?" I laughed. "Different how?" "More natural," she said. "You're not translating in your head anymore." That observation was accurate. In the beginning, every sentence required translation. My brain would think in my native language first, then slowly convert the idea into English. Now the ideas appeared directly in English. Not perfectly, but naturally. That small change makes communication much faster and more confident. Emily then asked another question. "So what's the long-term plan for the business?" The truth was that I had not thought far beyond the next few months. Survival had been the first goal. Stability had been the second. But now a new possibility was appearing. Growth. "Maybe expand a little," I said. "Maybe add more services." She nodded thoughtfully. "You should think bigger." That suggestion felt both exciting and intimidating. Expanding a business means taking new risks. More customers require better organization. Sometimes it means hiring help or investing in equipment. But Emily's confidence planted a new idea. Maybe the small business could grow beyond a simple one-person operation. During the following weeks, I began observing other small businesses more carefully. How did they manage schedules? How did they communicate with customers? How did they organize their work? The United States has a strong culture of entrepreneurship. Many neighborhoods include independent workers, plumbers, electricians, cleaners, landscapers, delivery services. Each business represents someone's effort to create independence. Studying those examples became another form of education. And slowly a simple plan began forming. Improve organization. Increase visibility. Keep providing reliable service. Growth didn't require complicated strategies. It required consistency. Meanwhile, the community support continued increasing. One neighbor invited me to help with a small neighborhood event setup. Another customer mentioned the service in an online community group. Each small recommendation introduced the business to new people. But the most surprising moment came during a short conversation with an older customer one evening. After finishing a job in his backyard, he looked at the tools in my truck and smiled. "You know what I like about your work?" he said. "What's that?" "You care about doing it right." He paused for a moment. A lot of businesses forget that. That sentence stayed in my mind long after I left his house. Because it explained something important about long-term success. Skills matter. Language matters. But attitude matters just as much. Care. Responsibility. Consistency. Those qualities build trust over time. And trust builds opportunity. The small business was still growing slowly, but something inside me had changed. Confidence. Not the loud kind of confidence that demands attention.
The quiet kind.
The confidence that comes from surviving difficult moments and continuing forward. But the most meaningful lesson of the entire journey was still waiting. A realization about the role strangers had played in shaping the story. Because when I looked back at the path, from the first awkward English conversations to the growing business, I noticed a surprising pattern. Many of the turning points had one thing in common. A stranger who believed in effort. And that realization would become the final message of the journey. A message that could help anyone learning English, or starting a new life in a new place. The lesson strangers taught me. Looking back at the entire journey, one question often comes to my mind. What actually changed my life in America? Was it the small business idea? Was it learning English? Was it hard work? The answer is not as simple as choosing one thing. Because every part of the story was connected. Learning English opened conversations. Conversations built relationships. Relationships created trust.
And trust slowly built the small business.
But there was one surprising element behind many of those steps. Strangers. People who did not know my background. People who had no reason to help. Yet somehow, again and again, strangers played an important role in the journey. When I first arrived in America, everything felt unfamiliar. The language sounded fast. The culture felt different. Even simple tasks like ordering food or asking for directions required courage. Many immigrants and international visitors experience the same feeling during their first months in a new country. You feel invisible sometimes. You feel uncertain about every conversation. You worry about making mistakes. But something interesting happens when you keep trying. People begin noticing effort. Not perfection. Effort. That realization changed the way I understood both language learning and business. Early in the journey, I believed something that many English learners believe. I thought my English needed to be perfect before I could succeed.
Before I could start a business.
Before I could speak confidently. Before people would take me seriously. But real life proved something different. People did not expect perfect English. They expected honesty, clarity, and effort. Many of the customers who supported the small business never cared about grammar mistakes. They cared about reliability. If I said I would arrive at 10 a.m., I arrived at 10 a.m. If I promised to complete a job carefully, I completed it carefully. Trust grows from actions, not from perfect vocabulary. Over time, those actions built a quiet reputation inside the community. And that reputation created new opportunities. One evening, while walking through the neighborhood where many of my customers lived, I noticed something that made me pause. Several houses on the street were places where I had completed small jobs during the past year. At one house, I had helped move furniture. At another, I had repaired a broken fence. At another, I had helped clean a backyard after a storm. Each house represented a small moment of effort. Individually, those moments seemed ordinary, but together they formed a story. A story about persistence. And when I thought about the beginning of that story, I remembered the early days when English felt impossible. The long pauses during conversations. The fear of saying the wrong words. The temptation to stay silent. Language learning experts often say that progress happens when learners push slightly beyond their comfort zone. Not so far that communication becomes impossible, but far enough that the brain begins adapting. Every conversation with a stranger had been one of those moments.
A small push outside the comfort zone.
And over time, those small pushes added up. English improved. Confidence improved. Opportunities improved. Another important lesson also became clear. Success rarely arrives through one dramatic event. It usually grows through many small steps.
One conversation.
One customer. One recommendation.
One moment of encouragement.
Step by step, those moments build momentum. This is why real-life English practice can be so powerful. When language is connected to meaningful goals, building relationships, solving problems, creating opportunities, the brain learns faster. English stops being just a school subject. It becomes a life skill. A bridge between people. And that bridge was exactly what allowed the business to grow. During the past months, several neighbors had asked an interesting question. Do you plan to expand the business? The answer is still evolving. Growth takes time. But the possibility exists now in a way it never did before. More importantly, something else has changed. The feeling of belonging. In the beginning, America felt like a place I was trying to understand from the outside. Now it feels like a community I am slowly becoming part of. Not because everything is perfect, but because relationships have formed. Neighbors wave when they see me walking down the street. Customers greet me by name. And conversations happen naturally. All of that started with something very simple. Talking. Listening. Trying again after mistakes. For anyone watching this story who feels frustrated while learning English, there is an important message hidden inside this journey. Language improves through use. Not through fear.
Not through waiting.
Through use. Speak even when the sentence is not perfect. Ask questions even when the pronunciation feels awkward. Join conversations even when confidence feels small. Because each conversation is practice. And practice slowly becomes progress. Then progress becomes opportunity. Then opportunity becomes a new chapter of life. When I think back to the title of this story, Starting a Business in America / How Strangers Believed in Me, I realize something interesting. Strangers did not believe in me because I was extraordinary. They believed because effort is easy to recognize. Hard work looks the same in every language. And when people see someone trying sincerely, many are willing to support that effort. That support was the hidden force behind this entire journey. A coffee shop conversation. A neighbor's recommendation. A customer's encouragement. Small moments that slowly built a path forward. And the story is still continuing.
Because every new day brings another conversation. Another opportunity.
Another step in the journey of building a life, improving English, and growing a small business in America. The next chapter has not been written yet. But one thing is certain. Sometimes the people who change your life the most are the ones you had never met before. The story you just heard is not only about starting a business in America. It is really about something deeper, the quiet power of persistence, simple conversations, and the courage to keep learning real English in real life. Many people believe success begins with perfect language, perfect plans, or perfect timing. But this journey proves something different. Progress often begins with imperfect words, small actions, and the willingness to try again tomorrow. Somewhere in the next story on this channel, another moment will appear. Another conversation, another challenge, and another unexpected stranger who changes everything. So if you are learning real-life English, dreaming about building a life in the United States, or simply trying to move forward when things feel uncertain, this channel is for you. Subscribe to the channel, stay with these real English story practice journeys, and continue training your listening, reading, and speaking step by step. Because the next story might not only improve your English, it might change the way you see your own future.